In 2010, the world watched South Africa host the FIFA World Cup. Gleaming stadiums, modern highways, a country that looked like it had rewritten its destiny. And 16 years later, parts of that same country can't keep the lights on. Rolling blackouts have stretched for thousands of hours in a single year. Freight rail volumes have collapsed. Water systems began failing at critical levels. Public trust in the courts dropped below majority support. This didn't happen overnight. It happened slowly, in planning documents ignored, maintenance deferred, corruption normalized, institutions hollowed out. South Africa didn't fall from paradise in a single moment. It decomposed. And now the question isn't whether something is broken, it's whether the system can still hold together at all. Start here, in Johannesburg. Evening rush hour. The traffic lights go dark. Entire neighborhoods plunge into blackness. Shops slam their shutters. Hospitals scramble onto backup generators, the ones that still have diesel. And across the country, millions of South Africans do something that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. They light candles in the most industrialized nation on the African continent. In 2023, South Africa recorded 6,948 hours of load shedding, the worst year in the country's recorded history. That's not a typo. Nearly 7,000 hours where the national power grid simply could not meet demand. Blackouts hit 290 days out of the year. The CSIR, South Africa's premier scientific research body, estimated the economic damage at 2.9 million rand. That's roughly 170 billion US dollars torched in a single year. Businesses shutting down mid-shift, cold chains breaking, medical equipment failing, students studying by flashlight while an entire economy stumbled in the dark. And here's the part that should make your blood boil. None of this was a surprise. 25 years before the worst blackouts in the country's history, the South African government published a white paper on energy policy. It was December of 1998. The document noted that Eskom had roughly 39,000 megawatts of installed capacity, while peak demand sat around 28,330 megawatts. A comfortable buffer. But then it issued a warning that reads like a prophecy today. Under projected demand growth, that surplus would be fully consumed by about 2007. Major supply-side investment decisions needed to be taken by the end of 1999 to avoid a capacity cliff. The government had an entire decade of lead time, a clear deadline, an explicit warning from its own policy planners, and those decisions were not made. For more than a decade, the country coasted on aging coal-fired infrastructure while demand climbed year after year. No contingency was built. And when the Zondo Commission, South Africa's landmark judicial inquiry into state capture, finally pulled back the curtain on what had been happening inside Eskom, it didn't find negligence. It found systematic looting. Contracts steered to politically connected firms, maintenance budgets gutted to fund patronage networks, skilled engineers and managers pushed out and replaced by loyalists with no technical expertise. Coal supply deals are structured to benefit intermediaries rather than utility. The Zondo Commission documented Eskom as vital to the economy and laid bare patterns consistent with institutional capture. Decisions not made for public service, but for private extraction. The country's most critical infrastructure hollowed out from the inside while the lights flickered. Now here's where it gets complicated, and where South Africa's decline defies a simple narrative. By 2024, load shedding eased dramatically. Hours dropped to 1,656, a fraction of the 2023 nightmare. In 2025, South Africa went 232 consecutive days without a single blackout. Eskom CEO pointed to improved plant reliability and increased generated capacity. It sounds like a recovery, but look closer, and the relief is deceptive. Much of the improvement came not because the grid got stronger, but because demand dropped. Private solar installations surged across wealthy suburbs and commercial districts. Businesses that could afford it simply generated their own power. The CSIR explicitly noted the rising role of private embedded solar PV in reducing pressure on the grid. The rich bought their way out of the crisis, but the grid itself remains brittle. Eskom's aging coal fleet still breaks down unpredictably, and the moment demand spikes or a few key units fail simultaneously, and the system buckles. In February of 2025, multiple failures at the Majuba and Camden power stations triggered stage 6 load shedding without warning, the most severe tier of rolling blackouts, catching the entire country off guard. Just like that, the progress vanished. And here's the thing about electricity tariffs. They've climbed roughly 190% During 2014 to 2024, South Africans are paying dramatically more for a service that has become dramatically less reliable. The average tariff now costs almost 4 times more than new solar and wind generation per kilowatt hour. Citizens are essentially subsidizing the slow death of a system that many of them have already abandoned. Remember that point. The wealthy disconnect from the public system. That's the thread that ties this entire collapse together. Electricity is the bloodstream of a modern state. It powers hospitals, courts, rail signals, water pumps, data centers, fuel supply chains. When that bloodstream becomes unreliable, everything connected to it starts to fail. But when the lights go out long enough, other systems begin to crack too. If the power grid is South Africa's bloodstream, freight rail is its skeleton. And that skeleton, it's splintering. South Africa's economy is built on exports. Coal, iron ore, manganese, chrome, bulk commodities that need to be moved by rail from mines to ports. When rail fails, trucks replace trains, costs explode, and roads deteriorate faster. And export capacity becomes a gamble rather than a guarantee. In the 2017 to 2018 financial year, Transnet, the state-owned freight logistics company, railed 226 million tons of cargo. By 2022 and 2023, that figure cratered to 149.5 million tons, a 34% collapse in only 5 years. The following year brought only marginal recovery, 151.7 million tons. For perspective, in 2022, South Africa transported less general freight by rail than it did during the Second World War. So what drove the freefall? Cable theft, vandalism, derailments, infrastructure literally being stripped for scrap metal while trains tried to operate on it. Criminal syndicates targeted copper cables, signaling equipment, even overhead power lines. Entire stretches of track were rendered inoperable, not by age, but by organized theft. Transnet's own integrated report acknowledged a significant decline in performance and linked it directly to theft, vandalism, and network deterioration. Security costs surged as the company burned through scarce resources, trying simply to defend rail lines that should have been carrying freight. The downstream devastation is enormous. In 2023, coal exports plunged to a 30-year low, not because the mines ran dry, but because there weren't enough functioning corridors to move the product to port. Ships waited offshore. Contracts were broken. South Africa's hard-earned reputation as a reliable commodity exporter started to crack. The Gain Group, a logistics consultancy, estimated the rail crisis is costing South Africa roughly R1 billion per day in lost economic output, approximately 4.9% of annual GDP bleeding away every single day. By August of 2025, the government began opening the rail network to private operators. 11 companies were approved to run trains across 6 key corridors and 41 routes. A necessary reform, but also an admission that the state can no longer operate its own railways at a functional level. Transnet itself reported a half-year loss exceeding $100 million in the period ending September 2024. The company that once powered Africa's most sophisticated logistics network now needs emergency government guarantees, more than 145 billion rand worth, just to stay solvent. A country built on industrial logistics simply can't survive when its railways become scrap metal. But infrastructure failure doesn't just strangle the economy, it reaches deeper than that. It hits the body. More than a third of South African households reported severe water interruptions in 2023, lasting more than 2 consecutive days or more than 15 days total in a year. Statistics South Africa's 2023 General Household Survey puts that figure at 35.8%. In 2012, it was 24.3%. That 11-point jump represents millions of families losing reliable access to the most fundamental resource of modern life. On the wastewater side, it's even darker. The government's own Green Drop assessment found that 64% of wastewater treatment works are operating at high or critical risk, discharging partially treated or raw sewage directly into rivers and the environment. Not some of them, nearly 2/3. That's not a developing country statistic. That's a modern state losing control of its sanitation infrastructure in real time. The consequences are not theoretical. In 2023, cholera returned to South Africa, an outbreak that the Department of Water and Sanitation acknowledged killed roughly 40 people. The World Health Organization documented it as a public health emergency linked directly to deteriorating water systems. cholera in a country with nuclear energy capability and a stock exchange that trades in trillions. Cape Town already came terrifyingly close in 2018. Day zero, the point where municipal water would be shut off entirely, with residents lining up at distribution points under military guard. Officials counted down the days publicly. Panic buying of bottled water emptied store shelves. The crisis was driven by drought, but it cracked open a deeper vulnerability. South Africa's water systems depended on aging pipes, skilled operators, and long-range planning. All three are eroding simultaneously. And what happened in Cape Town wasn't an anomaly. It was a preview. A city can learn to live with blackouts. You buy a generator, you install solar panels, you adapt. But you cannot improvise sanitation at scale. You cannot jury-rig clean water. When water infrastructure fails, disease walks in behind it, and trust in the state collapses along with it. Now, blackouts, rail collapse, poisoned water, any one of these would constitute a crisis for a developed nation. South Africa is dealing with all three simultaneously, but none of it is the most terrifying part. Hey, if you're getting value from this breakdown, subscribe now, because what comes next explains why this isn't just inconvenience, it's structural collapse. South Africa recorded over 26,000 murders in 2024. That's an average of 72 people killed every single day. The country's intentional homicide rate sits at roughly 45 per 100,000, among the highest on the planet. The global average hovers around 6. South Africa's rate is nearly 8 times that. Among major economies, and South Africa hosted the G20 summit in 2025, its murder rate is roughly 959% higher than the G20 average. But the numbers alone don't capture what's really happening beneath them. South Africa now has more private security guards than police officers and soldiers combined. Over 600,000 active private security personnel patrol the country, compared to roughly 184 police officers. That's a ratio of more than 3 to 1. South Africa operates the largest private security industry on Earth, worth an estimated 50 to 60 billion rand, with over 16,000 registered companies. For every one police officer, there are roughly 3 registered security guards in the country. Let that settle for a moment. Armed response vehicles cruise through gated suburbs, CCTV networks funded by homeowner associations, electric fences ringing wealthy enclaves with panic buttons linked to rapid deployment units. Meanwhile, in informal settlements just a few kilometers away, there are no patrols at all. Witnesses stop coming forward because they don't trust the courts. Communities stop reporting crimes because they've abandoned hope in the system entirely. Afrobarometer's research confirms it. By 2021, for the first time in the survey's history, a majority of South Africans expressed little to no trust in the judiciary. When trust in justice collapses, perpetrators go unpunished, and the cycle tightens. 2 countries are emerging inside one. The wealthy retreat behind walls, compounds with biometric access, armed guards, private clinics on speed dial. But the poor? Well, they're left with whatever the state still provides, which shrinks every year. The economic toll of violent crime alone has been estimated at roughly 15% of GDP. Not just direct losses, but reduced investment, stunted tourism, and the cascading effect of an entire population living under chronic insecurity. This isn't just inequality, it's the social architecture of a fragmenting state. And that fragmentation is feeding the most dangerous mechanism of all. Because once it starts, well, it doesn't slow down, it accelerates. Here's how the death spiral works. Load shedding hammers economic output. Every hour of blackout means factories idle, supply chains frozen, digital commerce offline. Weaker growth shrinks the tax base. A smaller tax base means less money for maintenance and repair. Less maintenance means more infrastructure failure. More failure drives skilled professionals to emigrate. Doctors, engineers, accountants, taking their expertise and tax contributions with them. Capital follows them out the door. Businesses that can relocate do so. Those that can, they simply shrink. And with every turn of the cycle, recovery becomes harder. The very people that South Africa needs most to fix its broken systems are the ones that are most likely to leave. The numbers make this spiral visible. South Africa is the most unequal country on Earth, a designation from the World Bank. That's not my opinion. The Gini coefficient stands at 0.63%, the highest of any nation with available data. The richest 10% control roughly 71% of all wealth. The bottom 60% hold just 7%. Unemployment remains roughly 32% nationally. For young people aged 15 to 24, it's 58.5%. More than half of South Africa's youngest generation cannot find work. Nearly half of all young people aged 15 to 34 are not in employment, education, or training at all, just drifting, shut out of the economy entirely. Public debt has climbed above 75% of GDP. And GDP growth? Well, the IMF pegged it at just 0.7% in 2023, with a projection of only 1.3% for 2025. That's not remotely enough to absorb millions of desperate, jobless citizens into the economy. The Reserve Bank itself has acknowledged that load shedding alone has been shaving percentage points off potential GDP growth for years. Add the logistics collapse, the water crisis, the rampant crime, and the compounding losses become staggering. But here's the cruel truth that makes South Africa's story different from other failing states. This is not a poor country. South Africa has deep mineral wealth, sophisticated capital markets, a functional central bank, a free and increasingly trusted press. Media trust actually rose from 49 to 61% between 2019 and 22. It has the skeleton of a modern industrial state. The problem is not resources. It never was. The problem is institutions. Planning horizons shortened to election cycles, professional capacity replaced by political loyalty, corruption diverted maintenance budgets into private pockets, emergency measures became permanent policy, and temporary breakdowns became the new normal, until the system forgot what normal ever even looked like. And now we arrive at the most dangerous dynamic of all. Remember what happened with electricity? How the wealthy solved the crisis by going off-grid? Well, that pattern is repeating across every failing system. Private generators, private boreholes for water, private security patrols, private schools, private healthcare. The affluent are building a parallel infrastructure, functional islands inside a dysfunctional state. Every time someone disconnects from the public system, they lose a taxpayer, a voice demanding accountability, a stakeholder with leverage. The public grid loses revenue. The water utility loses paying customers. The police lose cooperation from communities that have already hired their own guards. When the wealthy detach from shared systems, those systems lose the critical mass that they need to survive. This is how a modern state dies. Not in a dramatic implosion, not with tanks in the streets, but through a slow, quiet fragmentation. Islands of stability surrounded by oceans of decline. Gated communities with backup power 5 minutes from informal settlements sitting in darkness. And the tragedy cuts deeper because of where South Africa started. It was supposed to be the miracle, the peaceful transition from apartheid. Nelson Mandela was elected by the same parliament that once upheld segregation, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the Rainbow Nation. For a brief, extraordinary moment, South Africa proved that a country could choose dialogue over bloodshed, reconciliation over revenge. In the years after 1994, there were real gains. A growing black middle class, electrification reaching communities that were deliberately excluded for decades. New schools, new housing, new roads. Access to clean water expanded. Life expectancy began to climb. The structural burden inherited from apartheid was enormous. The new democratic state had to extend modern services to millions who had been systematically denied them for generations. But there was genuine momentum. South Africa wasn't just surviving, it was building. What went wrong was not a single catastrophic decision. It was a slow accumulation of smaller failures, accelerated under the Zuma presidency into the systematic hollowing out of institutions that the Zondo Commission documented as state capture on an industrial scale. By the time that the damage became visible to ordinary South Africans in their daily lives, in the blackouts, the empty rail yards, the brown water from the tap, the rot was already deep. South Africa didn't wake up in hell. It built one, slowly, through decades of neglect, institutional capture, and compounding decay. The country still does have resources, it still has industry, still has millions of people who remember what it meant to believe in the Rainbow Nation's promise, who fought for a democracy that was supposed to lift everyone, not just those who could afford to opt out. But modern states don't die because they run out of potential. They die because their institutions lose the ability to convert that potential into reliability, into consistency, into a system that functions for everyone, not just those wealthy enough to build their own. South Africa's question is no longer whether it has the ingredients for recovery, it's whether the spiral can be broken. before the shared systems that hold the nation together lose the critical mass to function at all. Because that's what turned paradise into hell. Not a lack of wealth, not a lack of talent, but a failure to maintain the institutions that convert both into a functioning society. And every day that spiral continues, the distance between what South Africa is and what it was supposed to become grows wider. So what do you think? Can South Africa pull itself back from the edge, or has the fragmentation already gone too deep to reverse? Let us know in the comments, and if this breakdown opened your eyes, subscribe to Fall of Nations. We don't wait for collapse to make the headlines. We'll explain it before it's too late.